And they invited me today to come and talk about my journey. Actually, it's 4 journeys. I'm going to talk about a journey of learning about my family, learning about history of the United States and Texas, a journey of learning about how to write a book, and a journey of collecting data and information. And I'm going to divide it into 2 parts. I'm going to briefly talk about the book. It is a very hefty book, and it took actually 12 years and 3 months to write it, from the day I wrote the first word until it was published. I chose a theme, my family, a family. It's an extended family. I chose a space, the Guadalupe River Basin, and I chose a time, the period primarily between the Texas Revolution and the Civil War. Just for orientation, this is the Guadalupe River Basin here. It's where most of the action takes place. This happens to be one of the personalities in the book. This is my 3 great-grandmother. You'll know something about her later on. This photograph was made in 1855, and it was actually unpublished until I found it and published it. So we're going to be in the Guadalupe River Basin. And I'm going to summarize the family. My introduction to the family began when I was about 15 years old, when my grandfather would tell me about. He would start out talking about James Clinton Nell. He would talk about Francis and Sarah Elizabeth Berry, Johnson and Sarah Hembry Day, and James Hughes Callahan and Sarah Medissa Day. I focused on the Day and the the Callahan family. You will learn that the Day family came to Texas right after the Revolution, and they settled in and around Gonzales in the Seguin area. She and her husband had 6 daughters and 1 son. He died shortly after they came to Texas, and so she's left alone with 1 son and 6 daughters. As you can well imagine, 6 daughters attracted quite a number of men. And I talk about how all of these marriages occurred between these children and their husbands or wives. And I've explored this thoroughly throughout the book, but I want to orient you that this was a family that I focused on. It's a fairly large, extended family. I intended to find everything that occurred to these members, deeds, court actions, how they voted, where they were, what they did, what fights they got into, anything that occurred is what I collected and tried to organize into a coherent story. So we're going to focus on the Johnson. I focused on the Johnson and Sarah Hembry Day and the James Hughes Callahan and Sarah Medissa Day. I might just look at the names here: Mahala, Sarah Medissa, Hepzibah, Meekness Amanda. Aren't those fantastic names? Nothing, I don't think, like that occurs today. I thought about how I would approach these, and I initially started out to talk about summarizing each chapter, and I'm not going to quite do that, but I just want to start out on this slide to illustrate. I did follow these families when they came from different parts of the United States, and it forced me to learn history about North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Something that I did not know much about, and it's one of the wonderful parts of writing a history book is that you yourself will be forced to learn history. I did not know about the First, Second, and Third Awakening, or the New Light Baptist, or the displacement of the Cherokees and the Creeks from Georgia, or how land was distributed in Georgia. All of these have influences in Texas later on, by the way. But anyway, we'll move on to the next. I'm not going to do it I'm going to try to capture a theme throughout here. In the Texas Revolution, it attracted men. They wanted men to come and fight. One was a Georgia battalion. It consisted of about 3 companies, each company more or less about 50 men. a few historians have written about the Georgia Battalion. I focused on one company in the Georgia Battalion. I wanted to know everything about every man in that company. The Georgia Battalion started out in, obviously, Georgia. The capital was Mid-Edgeville, and I followed them as they traveled all the way from Mobile, Alabama to Louisiana, New Orleans, and over to Velasco. And in newspapers, I could find when they arrived and when they departed these places, and often I could find the names of the men who later showed up in muster rolls in Texas. So the Georgia Battalion arrives in Velasco. They are assigned to Fannin. And Fannin moves them eventually to Goliad. And while they're at Goliad, the Mexican army is invading. And there are a group of family that were Anglos, that stayed in Refugio. He sent the Georgia Battalion from Goliad, this is about 150 men, down to Refugio to collect these families and bring them back. When they got to Refugio, the Mexican army trapped them there. And they had a fairly extended skirmish for a day, and miraculously they escaped and wandered around in the wetlands of Texas and at one time, on March the 19th, they're located here, and the Battle of Coleto takes place. They eventually go to Victoria, and they're captured by the Mexican army. James Hughes Callahan was a sergeant in Captain Wynn's company, the company that I focused on. Now he's a captured man. The Mexican general takes these Texans back to, in the meantime, there's been a battle near Goliad, and all those men are captured. He takes these men back to Victoria, and they all know, Santa Anna his order, they're going to be taken and executed. A German colonel in the Mexican army knows this is going to happen, and he decides to save some men, and he asks for carpenters. James Hughes Callahan was a carpenter. He raises his hand, and a few other men do too, and they're set aside and left at Victoria, and the other men marched to Goliad. It is the only reason he was not killed at Goliad. He's the only person that was selected in the Wynn Company to stay at Victoria. Anyway, this is briefly the story of the Georgia Battalion. He's captured there, and he remains there. He finally escapes in late April after the battle at San Jacinto. And after he escapes, he ends up on a ship going back. He decides to go back to his family in Georgia, and he does. And he stays there for a while, and he comes back to Texas in 1837. In the meantime, the Day family have been in South Carolina. Johnson Day marries Sarah Hembry Day. Sarah Hembry's Day father was a hardline Baptist preacher. He converted when he was 50 years old. And he became a leader in the Baptist movement in South Carolina when he was 50 years old. He died at age 90, by the way. Her husband, Johnson, was an alcoholic. There are several documentations of this. He would be kicked out of the Baptist church periodically, and his probate, which I found when he died in Texas, was full of records of how much money he owed in alcohol he bought at different places. But anyway, they wander around from South Carolina to near Memphis, Tennessee, and then they come to Texas. They cross the Seguin River on Christmas Day in 1836, and they eventually end up in Gonzales. There are a lot of families in Gonzales, new families and old families. The old families did not like the new ones, and they basically made it a hostile atmosphere for them, so they formed the city of Seguin. Sarah Hembry Day, her children, all were original founders of the city of Seguin. In fact, Sarah Hembry Day, when they had town meetings, she was the only woman to vote It was by the way, it was a corporation, and she owned stock in the corporation, so she voted. I contend she was the first woman that voted in Texas. I admit it's a little bit odd that how it occurred. But anyway, she builds this house on the west side of Seguin, and it becomes known as the Ranger House. It was also where she had dances every Saturday night, and it's where the Methodist Church met on Sunday. This house stood until 1962. It was destroyed in 1962. This is a photograph of it, not shortly before it was destroyed. But anyway, this was called the Ranger House, and it's where the Rangers, as we call them today, they were called actually Minutemen back then, where they would congregate when they would go on patrols. I explored this thoroughly, what was going on in Seguin at this particular time. One person passed through in 1845. He was a topographical engineer, Seth Eastman of the United States Army, and he made drawings of everywhere he went, and he left this drawing. It's difficult to see in the reproduction, but in the book it's better. But he left a drawing of Seguin, and it's an example of how Seguin looked in 1845. What was occurring in this part of Texas is primarily conflicts between the Comanche Indians primarily and the Anglos who were settling there, and also with the Mexican authorities in Mexico. They had never given up that Texas really was independent, and they would attempt to invade on various times to reclaim it. Callahan was actively involved in every campaign, almost every campaign, and every skirmish that occurred in this part of Texas in the 1840, 41, and 42. In 1841, he was the captain of the Gonzales County Minutemen, and he took his men on patrols almost constantly. His records in the muster rolls and the records that he filed are the most complete of any Minuteman company at that particular time in Texas. How Minutemen occurred is that when Sam Houston was voted out of office and Lamar came in as governor, Lamar was intent on reducing the budget, and he decided the Texas Army was a primary place to reduce the budget, and he disbanded the Army, and he created the Minutemen, which counties could form at their own discretion, and Callahan formed his Minutemen and patrolled along the frontier. And we have a very thorough account, which is explored in 2 chapters, about what he did and the men he organized in his various companies at this particular time. One campaign was known as the Howard Campaign, took place in 1840, and as you can, I've traced where they went. Based upon reports that were sent to the state government or reports that participants left in their records. I haven't shown it on this slide, but in the book there are several other maps of Callahan's campaigns in 1841. In 1842, Texas was invaded twice by the Mexican Army. One in March and the second one in September. It's called the Wall Invasion. And Callahan was involved in the fighting in the Wall Invasion, particularly around northeast of San Antonio. These are explored extensively, as I said, in the book. There were several themes that emerged as I went through my journey. I told you about the New Light Baptist and the First Awakening. Now I arrive at the time when Callahan meets Sarah Medissa Day. She was already married. She had married a man in 1837, and she claimed that he abandoned her. There are extensive records in the court minutes and in documents with the Texas legislature about her trials and tribulations of getting a divorce. Now, so this led me to explore what was divorce like in Texas in the 1840s. It was not that uncommon, by the way. And if you will look carefully at, there are other people who have studied this besides me. Most of the divorce filings were made by women for a variety of reasons. But anyway, Sarah Medici, she fell in love with Callahan, and they started living together in Seguin. She wanted a divorce. So she goes to the lawyer and files for a divorce in the fall of 1841. It is scheduled for the district court in March of 1842. The Mexican invasion causes this court not to meet. It is rescheduled for the fall of 1842. The army invades again, and it's also delayed, and her lawyer, by the way, is captured by the Mexican army to Mexico. Isn't this an interesting chain of events? Anyway, she's living with Callahan, and she's desperate for a divorce. Now, you could get a divorce also in Texas by filing a petition with the state legislature. She did. The House approved it. The Senate would have approved it, except one man decided that he wanted to hold them all up, and all divorce applications in the state, this is the Republic of Texas, and the legislature at that time were put on hold, including hers. Now, she's desperate. She's pregnant. And finally, the court meets in March of 1843. She gets a divorce, and they're married 10 days later with Callahan. I explored, as an example, I explored divorce. I also explored probates. I explored the formation of churches and schools in this particular part of Texas. So Seguin was a very rugged log house cabin in the 1830s. By 1853, when this picture was made, you can see it's a very thriving village. People are riding in carriages. The houses are painted. The roads are macadamianized. It is now a thriving town, not a village. I explore how Seguin changed from this rugged town to a thriving village. In fact, there are many articles in newspapers that claim the Seguin Public School was the best in the state of Texas. This caused me to explore the public schools in Texas at this particular time. People were intent that their children were going to be educated. And the school system, what we would call charter schools today, were not doing their job, and public education was the thrust of not only the state government, but the local governments. And I explored the formation of the schools and how it affected influenced the development in the Guadalupe River Basin. Callahan moved, and his wife moved 3 times. They first lived in Seguin. They next moved from Seguin to a small town of Prairie Lee. They founded the village of Prairie Lee. And this led me to review and discuss how villages were founded at this particular time. Anyway, they founded the village of Seguin, and I followed the development of Seguin over a few year period, and when hotels arrived, drugstores, doctors, public schools. And their remnants of Callahan family are still there today in the naming of creeks in the streets. But anyway, they settle in Prairie Lee, and it looks like they're going to be settled there forever. But Callahan was not a guy to stay in one place very long. And he was looking for, by the way, let me back up one point. The Callahan and Day family had a choice. They could be cotton farmers or they could be ranchers. They chose to be ranchers and not cotton farmers. You can discover this by looking at tax rolls, census rolls. They seldom grew any cotton. For that matter, they didn't grow many crops except what they needed to survive. Anyway, Callahan decides that he moves to upstream on the Guadalupe River Basin on the Blanco River to an area that he and 4 other men decide they're going to develop into a town and a county. They formed the town of Pittsburgh. It is not on the map. It disappeared. You will also see there's a town here, Middletown, formed by 2 Germans. It's no longer on the map. It's a ghost town. But anyway, in those days, there were small, thriving villages. So he moves to on the frontier, moves his family, and decides that he and these 4 guys are going to form a land company and sell land as a means of earning income. So now we have Callahan and his family. This takes me back. Let me back up here. It leads me to discuss and explore land development in Texas. Texans are well known for developing land, even today, and its history goes all the way back to there. And I discussed many land development projects that took place up and down the Guadalupe River Basin. He needs money for his venture. A man in Guadalupe County, his name was Michael Erskine, decides he's going to drive a bunch of cattle, a herd of cattle from Seguin to California. Why? When the gold miners went to California, there were not enough cattle in California to feed them. The ranchers in California couldn't keep their hands on the land, their cowboys on the land to raise the cattle. All the cowboys wanted to go to the gold fields. There was a desperate need for cattle. You could buy one cow in Texas for $5 and you could sell it for $150 in California. So several people drove cattle in 1853 from Texas to California. There were a lot of other herds going, by the way, from Missouri. That's where the greater majority of the livestock went, to California, not from Texas. But anyway, in 1854, Michael Erskine decided he's going to capitalize on this. He borrows money, buys 1,100 head of cattle, gets a horse herd together, and collects a bunch of cowboys, and he hires Callahan to ramrod the drive to California. Erskine kept a diary of this trip every day. Another man in another herd kept a diary. There were other people going to California along this route that kept diaries. I took all of these together to create a story of what it was like to travel this space of land from Seguin, Texas, all the way to California. As you can see on the map, it's rather interesting, and it was a difficult journey, and at some point it crosses into Mexico. Along the way there were 2 skirmishes with Indians, one in Texas and one actually inside Mexico. These I discussed very thoroughly. The important point here is that there were cattle being driven from Texas to California at this time. It is not very well known. I searched the newspapers and could document that 25 different herds left Texas about in this area and went to California. And probably they carried with them somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 cattle, not a whole lot. And some of them perished. Some of them, Callahan was one of the most successful of the herds. Here, they arrived at about 880 head of cattle. But I explored this part of the United States and what was going on history-wise in the United States at this particular time. So he takes his cattle to California, and he's supposed to be paid $1,500, and he comes back. He doesn't get his $1,500. Erskine runs out of money, tells him to go back home, and his son will pay for it. His son didn't have the money. Erskine had borrowed so much money, his son barely could make a living. And now he's back in Texas, Callahan is, and he joins up with his partners. This is the main partner, William Early Jones, a distinguished-looking man. He was a lawyer. He's originally from Georgia, the same area as Callahan. He came to Texas with his family in 1840. In Georgia, he started 2 newspapers. He was a member of the legislature. He comes to Texas. He joins the legislature in the House of Representatives. He's one of the people that were captured in San Antonio in the fall of 1842 and carried to Mexico. So he spent a period of his time as a prisoner in Mexico. Anyway, back in Texas, he decides to give up his practice. He was a district judge. He resigned, and he went to live near this area here. But they chose to develop the Horace Eggleston survey. Callahan owned half of the Benjamin Williams survey. And I discussed about how people collected land at this particular time. I trace the history of the land transactions of each of these surveys from the time they were created during the Mexican period until Callahan and his partners buy the land. And it's a fascinating tale of how land was transferred from one person to the next person, and so forth. But it is a small example of how land was dispersed in Texas and how different people acquired land. So Callahan and William Early Jones, by the way, he's after the Callahan family, he's the most important character in the book. And he's not very well known. One dissertation was written about him in the 1930s. He's still someone that needs to be studied. He had a very unique attitude about life, and he has a very clear record left in the legislature and in the court records. So Callahan, William Early Jones, and his partners want to sell land. They have a major problem. Indian raids are driving off customers. And Jones in particular, he was a drumbeater. He would write letters to the governor. He would publish letters in the newspapers complaining that all of the local inhabitants are being run off and no new immigrants are arriving. 2 days after they bought the land, he's in the governor's office and asked for a ranger company to be formed to control the Indian raids, and Governor Pease asked Callahan to form a ranger company and protect the frontier. And he did. He went there. You will see here's a defensive line he set up in this one, and a defensive line he set up here. The Callahan Expedition of 1855 has been studied by numerous historians, and most have concluded that it occurred as a means to reclaim escaped slaves to Mexico. I concluded differently, by the way. However, it caused me to understand what was going on about escaped slaves in Texas at this particular time. There is also in one of the universities in East Texas called the Slave Project, in which they are describing the magnitude and the scope of slaves escaping in the 1850s. But anyway, people believe there were numerous slaves in Mexico. There were not, by the way. And Callahan decided, but at the same time, the Indians that were causing the raids were the Lipan Indians, and they were based in Mexico, and they would come across the Rio Grande, raid for horses and cattle, and haul them, mainly horses, and take them back to Mexico and sell them. So he decided that he was going to chase the Lipans into Mexico. Now I'm going to summarize 6 chapters very quickly. He chases them into Mexico, And he crosses the river here at Fort Duncan, and they have a fight near San Fernando, and it is a draw. And he retreats back to Piedras Negras, and the next day he and his people burned the village down. It was mainly wooden and straw huts, but it was burned to the ground. In the meantime, there was a Colonel Emilio Langberg. Now, this was a Danish aristocrat, a colonel in the Mexican army. Unusual character, another person that needs to be written about. So this draws me into understanding and studying about what was going on in northern politics of northern Mexico that had Langberg on the frontier, and and arguments between the conservatives and the liberal of who was going to control the territory. It is a complex and set of circumstances, but and discussed thoroughly in these 6 chapters. The message is that there was a lot of turbulence on the border. Callahan got mixed up in it, and he was humiliated and defeated and withdrew back across the border. He decided that he would form a regiment and invade Mexico. It came of nothing, and he went home. He was sullen and withdrawn, and not a happy person. Now, let me back up one step here. I told you my journey was looking for records and documentation. This is a photograph of D.A.T. Walton, made in 1855. I suspect it is made shortly after he was in the Callahan Expedition, shortly after they withdrew back across Mexico. Distinguished looking young guy, isn't he? He's got a pistol in his hand, a Bowie knife in his belt. I found this, and I'll tell you later how. I also explored the skirmish that the Callahan had with the Mexican militia. And how I did this is I used satellite imagery of today and overlaid on that satellite imagery where the positions of the people were in the battle. A man who was in this skirmish left a description of where these written description and a drawing about where these various members of the Callahan Expedition were and the Mexican militia were. And I overlaid it on a satellite image so it gives you some idea of where the topography of they were fighting. I know exactly where it occurred. The Mexican Army records the location, geographic location of most of their skirmishes. This one was recorded in the Mexican archives, and a friend helped me find it, and then I could search on the map, the Google map, and find it. I bought this, by the way. This is a high resolution made in 1955 by the U.S. Army. So Callahan's back home. He resumes being an entrepreneur of selling land. He had sold, before he left to go on his trip to California, he had sold a parcel of land to Woodson Blasingame. Woodson lived next door to Callahan's farm. And he comes back home after the Callahan Expedition, and there's some sort of argument between Woodson, the Blasingame family, and the Callahan family. This is a family feud that historians have never explored. I'm the first one, I think, who's explored it in depth. There are quite a number of articles, newspaper articles written about it at that particular time, and there have been people who lived in the Blanco area who recorded their views of what occurred. It is uncertain why Callahan and Blasting Game got into an argument. And I explore all the options and possibilities that people have proposed. In any case, Callahan and two of his buddies, William S. Johnson and E.C. Hines, these are neighbors, and William S. Johnson's son, Thomas S. Johnson, they're going over to the Callahan cabin, and they went over there to try to stop the feud that was going on. And on the way over there, Callahan asked what he should do, and he was recommended be peaceful. They ride up to the cabin, and how do I know this is facts? These are depositions of people who were involved later on, and I'll tell you about how I discovered these. No historian has ever seen these before. They ride up to the cabin. Ms. Blasting Game's in the south room, standing in the door, and anyway, there's a conversation, and Woodson and his son Calvin are in the north room, and they poke holes in between the logs, and they stick their shotguns out. They shoot Callahan and kill him instantly. The same with William S. Johnson, and seriously wound A.C. Hines, and Thomas S. Johnson was unscathed. Callahan is dead. And I'll pick up that in a second. This is still there today. This is the south cabin of the Blasting Game dog trot cabin. In fact, I had a family reunion with my cousins and aunts here on this location. There's a man who has preserved this, but the Blasting Game cabin is still existing today. This is the door that Mary Blasting Game was standing in when the shooting occurred. So the Blasting Games are arrested. They're hauled off to Middletown. 7 days later, a mob breaks in and takes them out and shoots and kills both Woodson and Calvin. There are a chapter about who this mob was. And it's totally confusing in the literature, and I try to sort through it, and I never could figure out who killed the Blasting Games. More than likely, one of the three brother-in-laws you saw in the first slide shot and killed Woodson and Calvin Blasting Game. The guards are arrested. There's a long series of trials. The case is moved from Comal County to Guadalupe County to Caldwell County. Eventually, all either found not guilty, the charges are dismissed. Three other brother-in-laws are arrested. The case is kept in Comal County. One of them, two of them never show up in Comal County when they are summoned. But the one that does show up, eventually the charges are dismissed. The other two, the charges are dismissed later on. And I explore how all of this occurred. And I looked at the legal system from about 1855 up to 1866, more or less, and how the Civil War disrupted justice in the United States, using the example of the men arrested for the killing of Calvin and Woodson Blasting Game. There's a probate. I looked at several probates. This is James Hughes Callahan's probate. There's a lot to read here. But they had 5 bedsteads, 3 mattresses, 8 quilt tops, 3 counterpanes, 5 blankets. Is that 8 quilts, pillows, pillow slips, calico bedspread, quilt linings, coverlets, bed ticking, pillow ticking, chamber pot, and 5 pairs of sheets. They were quite well off. And if you can explore this more thoroughly in the book, but this gives an insight into what a moderately wealthy person's wealth was and their possessions were during this period of time of Texas in the 1850s on the frontier. Probates. Miss Callahan dies 7 months after her husband dies. The probate, by the way, continued until 1870. There were 3 administrators, several different probate judges, and so forth. It is a fascinating tale of how probates were interrupted by the Civil War. She dies. Orphans are left. I follow the orphans, by the way, until they all die. One is my 2 great-grandfather. I also follow all of the people in the family that I listed on one of the early slides. This is one of the daughters. She died in about 1900. She was a prosperous mill owner, a single person after her husband died. This was the only son, James Milford Day. This is an iconic photograph, it appeared often in several different places, but I followed the family, what happened to them after all of these events. Callahan and his family were buried in the Blanco Cemetery and disinterred in 1933 when there was during the Texas Centennial, there were a lot of historical markers placed up and a lot of particularly men that were considered important in this period of time were moved and buried in the state cemetery, and that's where he, his wife, and one of their sons, and probably a third one are buried. This is his tombstone on the front side and the tombstone on the other side, and I discussed how what occurred in the Centennial period of how the process went in disinterring Callahan and other bodies as well and moving those to the state of Texas Cemetery. And that more or less brings me to the summary of the book. Now I want to talk about my process. I wanted a book that met academic historian standards and published by an academic press. This is the highest standard you can have. I'm not an academic historian. I'm a scientist. But that was my goal. I'm very good at collecting, organizing, and telling a story, but I am not a good writer. Writing scientific material made me into a terrible historian writer. I collected probably in the neighborhood of 150,000 digital images. I had 20 running feet of documents that I collected. Many of them were photocopies. I prepared tables and maps and figures and so forth, and I drafted the narrative. It took me 12 and a half years to draft the narrative from the day I started writing until it was published. I asked historians to read it, and I used professional editors to polish the manuscript. I had 4 editors, and each had a different purpose in taking my narrative and putting it into a readable manuscript. I would have never been able to accomplish that without these professional people. One of the editors created my bibliography and endnotes. It is if you're not well trained at this, it is an extremely challenging task to create a bibliography and endnotes by today's standards. But anyway, and one of the editors was a historian. His name is Rick McCaslin at the University of North Texas, and I got to know him. But anyway, he helped a lot in creating this narrative. When I had the manuscript finished, I was real proud of myself. 920,000 words. Well, this is a 2-volume publication. This is great, I said to myself. I sent it to the editor at the University of Oklahoma Press, and he got back to me and he said, it's too long. And I said, Kent, you haven't read it. He said, it's too long. You've got to cut it down. I had to cut 420,000 words. The manuscript ended up being 502,000 words, and these editors, particularly Rick McCaslin, helped me do that. It was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life to interface with these editors and to watch how they could take the awful sentences I wrote and turn them into a readable sentence. Why? Because this is what they do day in and day out. I didn't do this. And I enjoyed that part of the process. But anyway, this was what I went through. By the way, all of the records that I collected About 2/3 of those I took and donated to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas archives. I've still got some left, and some are going to the archives in New Braunfels and some in Guadalupe County. But my intent is to leave all of my documentation so historians can look at them later. How did I do this? I used newspapers a lot. They were a major portion of how I collected data. The Portal to Texas History, if you're not familiar with it, it have almost every old Texas newspaper in a digital format searchable. I use another one, newspapers.com. There are commercial sources. I use online newspapers. Almost every state has some repository where their old newspapers are online. The University of Georgia is one of those that I use extensively. I source documents from state archives. I even source documents overseas, primarily in Mexico. I visited the archives, the military archives in Mexico City, and the state archives in Nuevo Leon and Coahuila. I even used a German newspaper, the New Braunfels Zeitung. Newspapers were a heart of what I did, and if you're going to write about this period, newspapers are going to be something you cannot avoid. I think even in later periods you need newspapers as well, and fortunately they're online. I use county records, deeds, probates, tax rolls, court minutes, and court records. There is a difference between court minutes and court records. All of these were microfilmed by the WPA in the 1930s and put in the state archives. You can order the microfilm, and they can send it up here, and you can make digital images of, which I did for many of them. Except court records are kept in the district clerk's office. And in the case of the Callahan Blast and Game court records, I went to the district clerk's office in Comal County and asked for them, and it created a stir in the audience, in their office. And finally they came back and said, we shredded those 17 boxes a few years ago. But fortunately they kept these, kept digital copies, and I was able to get what I wanted to. By the way, I bought every digital copy, every digital record of these court documents of these 17 boxes, and I gave them to the archives in the museum there in New Braunfels. The Texas State Library and Archives is a major source that I use. They have, as I told you, they have all of these records on microfilm in their facilities, and you can bring the microfilms here and look at it yourself. The FamilySearch.org they've got almost every tax roll of every county in the early part of the Texas history that you can search online. Searched a lot of records, county records, state records, muster rolls, government correspondence, legislature records, laws, and so forth. All of these are available. Most of these are available in some sort online. If not, you can order it from the Texas State Archives fairly inexpensively, by the way. Of course, I use the Texas State Library and Archives, the Texas Land Office, the local library, and I use survey maps on the previous. I'm going to go back. These are the survey maps that I'm talking about. National records, the census in 1840, 50, and 60, they had agriculture censuses. Very helpful to me. One of the records was the ship passenger records, in which Callahan was on from Velasco, Texas, going to New Orleans, and here is a partial list of the people that are on it, including the German colonel who set him aside. He was captured. I sourced documents from the National Archives, the Bureau of Land Management, and a variety of published books. I went to Mexico, to various archives. And in the case of the state of Coahuila, these are all online. I profiled people, where they were, and why they came here. I looked at books. I used Ancestry.com. If there was someone mentioned in a muster roll, I tried to find a descendant, and oddly enough, about 200 responded to me. I found diaries and records that people have never seen. This is one of them. This is D.A.T. Walton. His is at the Sul Ross University. Sarah Hembry Day had a prayer journal. It's in one of the hands of my descendants. I've got a copy of it. I discovered 6 other diaries that historians have never seen, one written by a German lady living in Seguin in the 1850s. Now let me talk about the publishing process. It is a part of my journey. The publisher chooses you and the title. It is a peer-reviewed critique. I told you about the length of the manuscript. I had to compromise. They had 2 or 3 internal reviews and the final editing, and then it went through a process of publishing, and now I am promoting it. So let me stop there. I appreciate you listening to me. I did bring books. You can buy them for me. They're $40, $45 if you want to buy them online. It's a hefty book, but I've tried to encourage you to look at and read the book. But I also want to encourage you that if you have interesting stories in your family history, you can write it as well. I did. I know you can.
All right. We're going to start with our audience here in person. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
You mentioned some relatives who were hardline Baptists in South Carolina. Do you know what part of the state?
Yes.
Okay. The question is, you mentioned some hardline Baptist ancestors that were in South Carolina.
Yes.
And tell us more about what you learned.
Yes, in the Tiger River area. They were already hardline Baptists when they came to North Carolina. This is part of the Second Awakening after the Revolutionary War. Most awakenings occur after major wars. Anyway, they settled in around the Tiger River area. They had a very charismatic preacher there. And when this was before the Revolutionary War when they went there. And the people, the people in the coastline of South Carolina wanted to separate from Britain, and they were suspicious about these folks living on the Tiger River. And it's interesting the discussion they had about, are you a patriot or are you not a patriot? In fact, the pastor, he was not a patriot by our standards. He went somewhere else, but it was the Tiger River.
I have ancestors from the Anderson area in the northwest corner. They also were very hardline Baptists.
And it was also a place where the moderators and regulators fought. These were people. They had different sides of local politics, but they were called moderators and regulators.
Other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned, you had to really cut your book down, and so. Did you leave something out that you would have loved to have kept in?
Okay, so the question is, you mentioned how much you had to cut out of this book. Is there one thing in particular that you really would have liked to have kept that really pained you to have to cut out?
Well, I'd like to have kept all of it in, but I told you I left the records with the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. I also gave some records to the libraries in Caldwell and Guadalupe and Comal County. The long version is in those records, so people can go and read what was cut out. When I ran across somebody, I had this wonderful idea. I'm going to profile this person in the book. So I wrote a little 2 or 3 sentence bio. The lady who did the index, she said, I've never seen so many people mentioned in a book. So I had probably 1,000 sentences written about people. Those got all cut out. And I wrote about putting events into perspective. That is a little more detail about the New Life Baptist, about the First and Second Awakening, and all of those got condensed down. So I had a choice to leave it in and argue and not get it published, or to get it published by an academic press, the #1 academic press for Western Americana, and I chose that.
Okay, and you had a question.
How many pages would you end up with?
How many pages did you end up with?
About 625, about 100 and some odd that are endnotes and bibliography, so it's about 500 pages of narrative. I also wanted lots of maps. And there are a large number of maps here. I believe in maps. If you saw from the presentation, I used the maps. And there were a lot of tables originally. In the original edition, a lot of those I'm a scientist. Everything I do gets reduced to tables. And I had to cut a lot of those out, so I had to make some choices. Yeah, it's about 500 pages of narratives with maps and figures and tables.
Oh, yes.
Can you recommend a source for more information about the cattle drives to California?
Can you recommend a source for more information about cattle drives to California?
A source. The book. Okay. No historian has studied comprehensively all the drives that went from Texas to California at that time. I've discovered them by reading the newspapers, both in Texas and in California. Because on the California side, they would talk about when they arrived and what happened to them, and in both places they would talk about what happened in between. But so this book is the best one I think, about the cattle drives in this particular year. Yes.
Okay. Anybody else here in our audience? Okay, think you may come up with something. In the meantime, we're going to turn to our Zoom audience to see if we have any questions there.
We do have some questions from the Zoomers. Let's see. Did you encounter the Burleson family in your research who lived around Bastrop?
Yes. In the Callahan Expedition, the lieutenant was one of the Burleson families. His father was Edward Burleson, one of the presidents of the Republic of Texas, and he was involved in it. Yes, the Burleson family.
Okay, and our next question is, one of the most helpful lectures to the generational historian who longs to document ancestral journeys. Shout out to Rick McCaslin's generosity and expertise. And also, is the...
Well, can I interrupt there?
Certainly.
So I told you, part of this is my journey. I met a lot of new friends. My immersion in life up until I started this was a science at Alcon. It was a very intense environment, and there are a lot of wonderful people there that were a part of it. However, in this, I became friends with a lot of historians, and Rick is an example of that, and Debbie is also sitting in the audience, but there were several others, and I enjoyed developing these friendships and listening to what they say about history and how historians live.
Okay, let's see. Is the PowerPoint available for our use?
What's the rule of the Fort Worth Library?
So today's presentation will be recorded and the video will be available on YouTube. It usually takes about 10 days to 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer to get that. We're getting some feedback now. We're looking at 1 week. So
this is a little bit technical. So you're saying I own the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, the PowerPoint is yours.
Okay. And Debbie, what do you think about turning it loose to the public?
If you've already got it online on YouTube, then they can use it on the YouTube, is what we usually do.
Okay, so if someone wants my PowerPoint, if they will get in touch with Leanna at the Center for Texas History, she will get that message to me. I'll share it with you.
And you can contact me at l.schooley, schooley, at tcu.edu, or you can message me on Facebook or Instagram.
Okay, let's see if there's any other questions from the Zoom audience. I'm not seeing anything there. Any more in person?
I have one quick question, and I posed this to Sherry McElroy when she was here with us a couple of weeks ago, because she did some work in the French archives. How did you bridge the language barrier when you were working in the Mexican archives?
I was introduced to a person in a young man who worked at the archives in Nuevo Leon. I was told to contact him, and he's my host. He eventually came a couple years after this and went through a PhD program at SMU for history. But he was my entry and took me around to the archives in Nuevo Leon, and he introduced me to the people in the archives in the state next door, Coahuila. I also wanted to know about the Lapons. There are Lapon organizations in Texas today that are trying to petition the state and the federal government that they need to be recognized, and they had a historian, and she put me in touch with a young guy who interviews and studies Lapon descendants in this area in northern Mexico. And so he is a consultant to the military archives in Mexico City. You cannot get into the military archives unless you have someone to introduce you. He took me there twice. So that's how I got into these archives. Now, the archives in Mexico City, most of their documents are online. You can go and search them and read them. They're all in Spanish, except service records of men, are not online. And I went down there mainly to photograph the service records of Langberg, Holzinger, and several other Mexican officers. I wanted to know who these people were. That's a constant question. But I was introduced by people in Mexico. I wanted to visit where the fighting took place just south of the border, but I was warned repeatedly by people, don't go down there. I still want to go and see where this battle took place. But anyway, that's what I visited the archives in Mexico City. I'm going to back up and use this. I told you I collected a lot of records. I didn't go to South Carolina. I didn't go to Georgia. I found someone who will go and do things for me and copy records, okay? It's expensive, but it was less expensive because I would have had to waste a week doing that, and I need to spend that week writing, I thought, and that's how I did it. But when I hired people to do stuff, they always collected digital records for me, and I had them at my fingertips back here at home. I mean, and I think this is the wave of the future of people. You're not going to have to visit a lot of archives, and many things are being put online. But going back to Mexico, that's the way I did it in Mexico City. I'm very familiar with Mexico. I've traveled there a lot. It's one of my favorite places to go. I speak Spanish, so it was not a difficult situation.
Okay, thank you for filling us in. All right, do we have any other questions from our okay.
So you went through this very methodically and very much like a scientist. But is there something that you came away from this that surprised you or gave you something overwhelmingly emotional about it?
Is there anything emotional?
Question, emotional. I think there are two parts of that question. I came away with something I'm going to tell you about, and that's why history and biology are the same. I'll talk about that shortly. What about emotional? Well, it was emotional to learn about my family. And obviously that Sarah Modesta Day had a very tragic ending. to the most extent, I was, my emotions were separated from what I was doing. I was more interested in what's really the facts here. I said I'd come back to a point. What was that?
History and biology are the same.
Ah, okay. My job at Alcon, for two-thirds of my life, I was in charge of the group that set up clinical studies with doctors. Okay? And so I had an opportunity to help design and approve and watch the studies unfold. If you want to register a drug in the world, you have to do controlled clinical studies, and we did them obviously for treating eye diseases. So I had an opportunity to see all of these. Let me tell you, there is not a clinical study we ever had that the results were black or white. It was always some gray. That's the nature of biology. And COVID is the best example of grayness in biology. So biology is gray. I concluded history is the same. There's nothing definite on one side or the other. It's a mixture of everything in between. And that's what makes it wonderful. I had another point, but it skipped me for the moment. But anyway, that's my perspective on what I learned about history. It's not any different than biology. And I guess that's normal. History is composed of biological creatures, and we're all different. We all have different makeups, and we react differently. And leaders are no different than you or I, by the way, fortunately or unfortunately.
Anyone else? Okay, well, first I want to say thank you so much. I don't know that we've had a speaker who exemplified our theme of preserving our past and really illustrating how you can get to that from scientist to historian, and many people do it from many other avenues, but this is such a terrific example, and we want to thank you for being here with us this morning. I want to mention to our audience that he will be signing books in just a few moments up here near the exit, so if you would like to visit with him there, we encourage you to do so. But could we please have a big round of applause for Dr. Tom McDonald?